Iceland is deceivingly named. Only about 11% of the place is covered in glaciers, and its cool maritime climate makes it surprisingly tolerable considering its northern location. It is actually this small island's exact location in the North Atlantic Ocean that makes it so livable. Its climate is highly influenced by a combination of ocean and air currents. In the sea, the Gulf Stream moves warm waters around the island, and a particular branch, the Erminger Current, wraps around the south and west of the island, while cool waters coming from the Arctic move past the north and east. In the air, a semi-permanent low-pressure zone just to the south, called the Icelandic Low, circulates the atmosphere in the region, bringing in warm air from the south and cooler air from the north. As these swirl and exchange close to the island, you can imagine that the weather and climate varies quite a bit, daily, yearly, and across decades. But in general, these conditions make it warmer and wetter in the south, and cooler and drier in the north. Even with this variability, average temperatures have climbed 1.4 degrees Celsius in the past 200 years. Recent warming has outpaced IPCC predictions, so where other parts of the world are expecting climate change, Iceland is already experiencing it. It is projected to warm by another 2 degrees by the end of the century, with a 5% increase in precipitation. Most people in Iceland welcome this change, or haven't noticed it. About 60% do not think that there has been any serious impact on their local environment. But changes have unexpected and long-lasting effects on Iceland's ecosystems and the natural resource economy, both good and bad. Take, for example, glaciers. Since 1990, they've been retreating quickly and are expected to disappear within 200 years. First, the good. Without the weight of the glaciers, the land is expected to lift up and might escape some damage from sea level rise. And, since about 3/4 of Iceland's energy is generated by hydropower, the expected 25% increase in glacier runoff would meet their green energy needs, maybe even a surplus. But now the bad. Increased runoff can change entire landscapes downstream, flooding farms and crops. And mapping of flood-prone areas is lacking. So even though municipalities are required by law not to build on these areas, it isn't always clear where they are. Current hydropower infrastructure can only handle a small increase in runoff, and the National Energy Company is working this into new constructions. But what happens when the glacier melt runs completely dry? One perceived positive effect to temperature rise seems to be that Iceland is becoming greener. Plant growth is helping to reduce soil erosion, a major concern, especially in the dry and dusty interior. Farming here is well established. Meat, dairy, and through the use of greenhouses, vegetable farming is common. But it is easier now to grow grains. Barley production has increased 18-fold in the last 20 years, and recently, farmers grew the amount of barley that they would traditionally import for animal feed, suggesting that the nation could become even more food secure than it already is. Akureyri in North Iceland. With 17,000 people, it's the largest town outside of the capital region and at the doorstep of the Arctic. Here, a debate continues about whether or not to market the town as a supply and service port to accommodate the expected increase in shipping traffic headed for Arctic waters. While some think it's a natural transition for the town to make, others feel that it welcomes risks.
Well, there's going to be both risks and benefits. This would obviously mean probably increased employment and increased economic activity and increased growth in the area that would be chosen or would be able to actually provide these services. There would probably be some sort of population boost as well, which also encourages more services because there's more pressure to provide these services. So there's all sorts of benefits. which makes it very understandable why communities want to consider this and want to participate in this activity. At the same time, of course, there are risks. A very rapid increase in population can increase pressure on the people that are already there and on the services, particularly if the services, the infrastructural services, for instance, in terms of schooling and healthcare, etc., doesn't expand at the same rate as the population. There are risks of accidents, there are risks of spillage, there are risks when you have oil tankers sailing around the coast. No matter how much you try to prevent it, accidents do happen. So whether to be an accident off the coast of Iceland, of course depending on the conditions and the locations at the time, this could have a very bad effect on the ecosystem and the social systems in Iceland. For fisheries, for ecotourism, and we have to consider, is this worth the sacrifice? It's a question of looking at both sides of the equation and trying to figure out the best way to do this. Obviously, we cannot avoid looking at opportunities because likely, whether we like it or not, or whether we participate or not, this is going to happen. What we want to do is have a voice in it, and we want to try to do this in as sustainable manner as possible.
Iceland is characterized by fishing. It has deeply shaped their culture and economy, with about 40% of the country's GDP connected to the industry. Changes in the ocean would send shockwaves resonating throughout the country. Ocean surface temperatures have been rising, and new species are arriving. Mackerel, a species more commonly fished in Spain, the UK, and Norway, is one such arrival. When Iceland started commercially harvesting the species a few years ago, it sparked an international conflict with Norway and the EU.
At the moment, the disputes or the discussions are at a stalemate, where the traditional fishing nations, they won't give up their resources, which is quite understandable. And then you have Iceland and Faroe Islands, which are claiming more. Now they just have to reach an agreement of how much. And that it's easy to say, but it's very hard when you're negotiating about such a big issue. The change that occurred here with the mackerel was in the beginning and still is quite positive. The fishing industry in Iceland was very flexible and quite adaptive to these changes. It took the companies only 2 to 3 years to be able to adapt their facilities, land processing facilities and the processing facilities in the boats into the standards of being able to cool down the fish and process it for human consumption. So they were extremely flexible. 2-3 years of so huge change. It's almost remarkable to see how well they were able to adapt.
Icelanders have always been an adaptable, resourceful, and prepared group, an identity shaped in part by their climate. But adaptation to climate change is not yet a strategic undertaking. There is no national adaptation strategy. And in a recent survey of 77 municipalities, only 4 had reported to have done something about climate change, while the rest had done nothing or didn't respond. So for this small island nation that derives its economy and cultural identity from the landscape and oceans, climate change stands to benefit them, at least in the near future, and they seem to be doing a good job of adapting to the obvious changes. But here, debate on climate change impacts and adaptations is dominated by short-term economic benefits and virtually ignores any political, social, and cultural aspects. To carry these benefits into the long term, all these need to be addressed. Iceland needs to have a deeper conversation and anticipate the wide-sweeping and deep implications of change and better plan for the nation's continued success.